Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Traci Scheepstra and this is Body Talk. Every week Embodied Learnings brings you Body Talk because we are committed to bringing the body into the elementary classroom and into the curriculum. We do this because we believe that it supports students with their learning, engagement, mental health and wellness, and for thriving classrooms and school cultures. Well, today we are talking about inclusion, including all bodies and movement, and I have a very special guest with me. This is Taylor Simpson. Hey, Taylor.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for having me. It's so great to see you.
I am so happy to have you with me today. We had the pleasure of working together in the spring where you created something absolutely amazing for Embodied Learnings. And I'm so happy that you're going to talk about what it is that you created and how people can learn from you. But before we do, I would love if you could share a little bit about yourself and your background.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me today. I'm a year two teacher candidate at the Faculty of Western here in London, Ontario. I'm currently completing my practicum in a grade 8 classroom, but I'm in the intermediate senior stream where I'll be able to teach grade 7 to grade 12 with a specialty area in French. But long ago when I was in high school, I kind of started my passion for inclusion and accessibility and what that would look like maybe in my life. I started out as a personal support worker for two kiddos with various disabilities. And I quickly realized that our society, education, all things in our world maybe aren't set up for success for people with disabilities or children with disabilities. And I started to think, okay, what can I do in my life? How can I somehow make an impact? And then that's why in my undergrad, I took disability studies where I minored in that. And I learned about the societal ways that we kind of disable people, how we're not making it inclusive, while also learning like medical diagnoses and things about disabilities. And that really has kind of led me to where I am today, working within education. And my hope to kind of make, whether that be on a school base or a school board base, education a little bit more inclusive, because I think right now we're doing what we can with what we've got, but there's still so much room for growth in that. And I've also kind of had my hand at working with an organization in London called Original Kids Theatre. And so it's a theater company for youth and children. And I had the pleasure of being their inclusion coordinator for the past 3 years, where I've worked with administration, camp staff, all the staff involved in making our camps and our main programming inclusive for all children, but also for staff members as well, which has been really awesome to see that connection of kind of the arts and inclusion at the same time.
Absolutely. I feel that we talk about inclusion in lots of different settings, but it's not as much talked about, or teachers may not really have the knowledge when it comes to the arts or something that's more movement based, embodied in
Mhm.
nature. And this is something where I think we can really sort of fill the gaps of information that seems to be lacking. Certainly with teachers and teacher candidates that I work with, a lot of the information that you have seemed to know and has become very intuitive is not for others.
Mhm.
But it's pretty accessible once you kind of get a sense of what it is you need to be looking for.
Absolutely. I think oftentimes the problem is, as like educators or mentors, things like that, we're thinking of like these big changes we need to make, and that we're looking at the most like extreme situations where we have to change our entire plans to make our space inclusive. But it's those small day-to-day actions that we do that actually make our classroom or our spaces inclusive, rather than the grand changes for like one student or one participant. It's making that an everyday habit of getting into, and it's challenging to start off with when you're first like, oh, I don't even know where to begin looking at your lesson plans or your programming you're doing. But once you start to see there's a pattern of things that you can kind of always refer back to kind of change in your programming to make sure every student or everyone can access it.
Okay. One thing you and I've talked a lot about is this idea of what it means to actually um, be inclusive.
Mhm.
And again, you've sort of already touched upon it, but maybe we can go a bit deeper about this idea that we're not trying to fit a particular student
Mhm.
or ability into, an environment or an activity, but can you talk a little bit more about sort of what this broader scope of inclusion really means?
Absolutely. So, oftentimes, when we are looking at creating inclusive spaces, the changes we're making that might be specific for one student benefit all of the students in the classroom, whether that's having those like body breaks that involve movement. Those are beneficial for every single student, not just a student that has on their IEP that they require more frequent breaks. Those breaks are important for everyone. Or looking at like everyone's bodies move differently. I'm not a talented dancer, so my body will move differently than a dancer will. But allowing the students to work at their own pace and work at a level that they're comfortable at, rather than just making, oh, this is for this person to be included, and then the rest of you are going to do this, but giving it kind of that like different level to the participation, and the different, letting the people choose what they want rather than forcing it into the classroom, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I know I've told you this story, but I think it might be also helpful for those watching, that I really learned this when I had a student at Western. So this was a second year teacher candidate who was not able to access the stage in the room where I was teaching. So I always teach in the auditorium, and we have this big, beautiful stage, but there is no way onto the stage but stairs, either stairs in the front and even through the back door. There's not a ramp, there's nothing. And so she was not able to access the stage. And there was no other space in the building that was appropriate, that had the technology that I needed and had the space for the number of students in my class. And so I had to really look at, how do I transform how I use my space that works for everyone, rather than, even though I knew I was doing it because I obviously had to accommodate her, but as I made those decisions, I realized that other students were choosing things that I hadn't given them as an option before. So there's a space at the bottom of the stage. So I would say, you can choose to move down low at this area, you can choose to move up high, or again, I would often have them do mindfulness where they come and lay on the stage. But instead I would say, you have the option of sitting in the seats in the front row if you prefer, or lying on the floor at the front, or sitting on the edge of the stage. And suddenly people were making all kinds of decisions where I went, oh my goodness, I could have been doing this all along, because I realized that was based on their comfort level. And so it totally, totally transformed how it is that I use the space, and realized that there were actually needs of many students that I had never considered. But it was because I had a student where I went, okay, she can't be on the stage, so I have to rethink it. That was a hugely profound experience for me as an educator, that really shifted my mindset, and I think created, well, it was a much more inclusive class by far. And then again, we would do, stations, but instead of the students rotating stations, the stations would do the rotations.
Absolutely.
So the attention was never on this student and she can't go on the stage. It just flowed. It flowed beautifully, but just in a different way.
And you still got the main learning out of your course that you wanted, right? It's not like you had to change what you were learning. It was just making those minor changes that then had a huge impact, rather than if you singled out that student, then they wouldn't have felt comfortable or safe in your classroom, and probably would have disengaged quite a lot from the classroom. Whereas they were able to feel like, oh, this is for all of my peers. They maybe didn't even realize some of the things you were doing was specifically for them, but as the whole class.
Yes, absolutely. And when I introduced it too, about just space and how we have to be aware of our environment, I pointed out all kinds of things. Like in our auditorium, the lighting is very low, but the stage lights are very bright. So sitting in the audience with the low lights, people sometimes get sleepy. So we don't sit in those chairs for long, but the stage lights actually were giving people migraines. And so the first year I taught, I realized, oh, don't use the stage lights. So it just became much more fluid for me each year of, oh, there's all these things happening. So when I just talked about environment, there were so many examples that nobody would have ever thought, oh, we're using different parts at levels because of the student. I had already set the framework of, there's just lots of considerations for all
Absolutely. And
people.
that's in any like work environment, school environment, things like that. There's so many different changes. Even like this year in the school I'm at, the desks have to be lined up in individual rows, but that makes it really challenging to move in and out to like touch base with students during a lesson. So we've had to be very strategic about like, okay, where do we place certain students in the classroom so that we can do our secretive check-ins with them without the whole class seeing like, oh, you're going to check in with that same student, because if we put them in the middle, we're not going to get to the middle of the classroom as often as we do as the outside of the class, because rows in like desks in a row make it really challenging. So we've had to really sit down and look at like, okay, these students need this from us, and we need to do this in a way that we're not going to single them out. So they need to be in this specific spot in the classroom. And so even things like that, that maybe sometimes aren't thought about right on the forefront, but do make a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really creative problem solving is what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Thinking outside the box big time.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, amazing. One thing that we were also talking about that makes a really big difference is the language that we use. So we touched a bit upon environment, and we'll get back to that too. But
Mhm.
inclusion is also about sort of how it is that we speak and whether we make people feel included or not, depending on the words that we
Mhm.
use.
Absolutely. And I think oftentimes there's like the obvious ones where we're not going to be using certain words within our like language that we have. With it being 2020, we've kind of removed a lot of those words, but it's also in the way that we frame things. So we've been saying like a person who is a wheelchair user rather than like confined to a wheelchair, or someone who has autism versus someone who's autistic, and just putting that person first, and
Mhm.
always making sure like they are a person, and their autism or their wheelchair or something like that is a part of who they are, but they may also be a mother or a father or a sibling or an aunt or an uncle or a teacher. They have so many different identities that we don't need to just focus on the one part of their identity that maybe makes up a lot of their life and takes up a lot of their life, but we don't need to focus in on that one part.
Mm.
We need to focus in on who they are as a whole and what do they need as a whole from us, and the intersectionality of that, whether they are a like cis woman who uses a wheelchair, how does that impact rather than a cis man who uses a wheelchair, and that kind of different intersectionality between each person. But then also, and I know we chatted a lot about this when I was working with you, is how we give instructions in our classroom and in our movement, where it's like, well, we can say like everyone put their arms up high, or we could just say everyone move up high, rather than
Mm.
saying like you're specifically your arms, or move down low, and someone can choose to see how what low is to them and what low they are comfortable with moving at, rather than giving a specific instruction of like getting on the floor. It's like, no, you choose what your body can do and what your body is comfortable doing, rather than the specific words that we're giving them.
Yes, absolutely. Because there's a big difference from your whole body going down low, which is not accessible to all
Mhm,
bodies, as opposed to move down low and somebody's able to move their hand down low or their foot down low,
mhm.
where they still have the concept of low, but they are interpreting it and doing it in a way that actually their body allows them to do.
Absolutely.
And I do that a lot when I'm teaching too, because again, I'm working with adults, but there's a lot of things that I cannot see.
Mhm,
Cannot see those that have um, injury. I cannot see those that may have osteoarthritis, fibromyalgia, different things that really inhibit their ability to do certain things because it creates pain, or
mhm.
again, there's certain mobility limitations. And so I will often say we are going to explore bouncing, but how you bounce is up to you. So it could be a very simple, gentle bounce that could come from your upper body or a bend in the
Mhm.
knee, or it could be where your feet actually lift off the floor. And you
Exactly.
can do it standing, but you can also do it sitting.
Mhm.
So it's really important that people gauge their bodies, but they can't do that if I don't give them cues that support that ability to interpret the movement in their own way, as opposed to
Exactly.
everybody bounce up and down and I want to see those feet lift off the ground.
Exactly. And yeah, giving people the autonomy to choose what that looks like to them, right? Like
Mhm.
my jumping is different than your jumping, and it's different than my friend's jumping. And like just allowing that person to say, like, oh, I actually have the autonomy to make that decision and to have the choice over my body and what that looks like in the classroom and in movement. Because I think oftentimes we try to force movement, or we try to force certain types of movement, which isn't always beneficial. In my placement right now, the French teacher does a lot of movements when they're teaching French, just because that helps students. But she uses a lot of language on the terms of, I want everyone to move their hand, but they can choose how they move their hand, or I want everyone to jump, but then she allows them, some students sit, some students stand, some students use their hands to jump, and allowing them to kind of, and seeing how that impacts their language learning as well. Because for them, if they have to jump and they can't jump, whenever they hear that instruction, all they're going to think is, oh, I'm that one student that I can't jump, and now I've missed out on the learning that's happened with that.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Mhm.
The other thing too is that we have a lot of different students that need to be included, where it's not even just their mobility, but it might be something else in terms of they may be very shy. They
Mhm.
might have a lot of anxiety. Um, so just moving at all is very challenging. And
Mhm.
so it's like inclusion, we're talking a lot about how you do that in movement, but
Mhm.
for some students, even doing the movement is really, really tricky.
Yeah, I actually did a drama activity with my students last week. We were working on learning about residential schools, and so we were doing um, they were reading a book, and they had to act out certain parts of the book, and they were in small groups. And all I said to them was, every person in the group has to participate in some form. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter what that form is. So they can be the person that draws the poster, or they can be the narrator, or they can be the person that does behind the scenes, moving props around, things like that. It doesn't matter what your participation in this is, it's up to you. And some students obviously were like the most dramatic and were so excited for that and wanting to be on the stage and doing that. Whereas other students were like, nope, I'm not comfortable with this. And then just helping them find like, okay, but these things are important. Writing out lines for people, or prompting people, moving chairs around, those things are just as important. It doesn't matter what that looks like, it's what you're comfortable with. And I think that really enhanced their learning, because a lot of them, when I said we were doing a drama activity, they were like, oh no, I am in grade 8, I'm at the peak of my like awkwardness, my self-esteem. And then when I was like, no, 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 you're not all getting up here giving me a monologue, like
Absolutely. And that's the misconception often with the arts, is that it is all performance.
yeah.
Whereas there are so many roles, it takes an entire team for any production to be put
Mhm.
together. And not everybody needs to be center stage. Not
Exactly.
everyone's going to be comfortable. And so for some students, it's enough for them to just be part of exploration and process
Mhm.
and to have fun doing that. But when it's about putting something together in performance, that there can be other roles.
Exactly. And there are so many roles. We see that in arts all the time. Like the behind the scenes stuff, we wouldn't be able to put on the productions we do without the behind the scenes work that goes on.
Yeah. Now, have you had any students that just did not want to participate at all?
It wasn't that they didn't want to participate at all. They were just like, there's nothing for me to do, was kind of the mindset they were in, because they were like, well, I'm not going to be the one on stage. I'm not comfortable with that. So there's nothing I can do
Okay.
with my group. And so that, I think, was like showing them that no, there is so much more to this. And then they were like, well, that's not, no one's going to see that. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, I've seen what you're putting into it, and that's all that matters. You've put in this creative thought. Or I had one student who has a really like visual mind, and they could really see how this was going to look on stage. And so giving the stage directions to their peers rather than being the one actually on the stage moving, they were the ones giving it. So no one actually like refused, but it was giving them that like, these are some options. What do you think you would be comfortable with doing?
Right. Now, I do have a lot of teacher candidates in the course I teach ask me, what do you do when you have students that refuse to participate at all in any activity? And I would say that probably happens less with older students, but
Mhm.
can be seen with younger students. And something that you and I've talked a lot about, and you created a beautiful visual, or you shared a visual in the document that you wrote as well, on
Mhm.
sort of levels of participation that allow for inclusion.
Yes.
So I'd love for you to share a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think often when we talk about participation, we think like it's got to be that 100%
Mhm.
full involvement in whatever the activity is, but there's so many other ways to be involved in activities, whether that be like an active observer, so you're sitting back and you're watching.
Mm.
I didn't do this with my students because I didn't have a student that was at this level, but when they did the drama activity, they could have, rather than participating in it, they could have wrote a observation that they learned from their peers or things that they saw their peers doing
Mhm.
for that drama piece rather than actually participating in it. They can observe what their peers are doing and like, oh, I can see that my peer used their tone of voice when they were speaking here, and that really highlighted this in the scene rather than actually being participating in the activity. They can learn in many ways, and the same goes with movement as well. As a dancer, you can learn dance from watching your peers or watching YouTube videos and pointing out the things that we have learned in class, whether that be the movements or different things like that. It doesn't have to be the full participation, and allowing people to kind of have that choice allows the learning to happen, like we've been chatting about.
Yeah, for sure. And I always tell anyone that I have ever worked with, who's asked this question, and or we've been talking about inclusion, that you must never ever force a child to go beyond what is comfortable. And of
Mhm,
course, I think it's good to challenge children, but
mhm.
we have to be very careful when that challenge becomes detrimental to their well-being.
Absolutely.
So it's one thing to invite a student to push a little, go past that comfort zone, but if it sets off a huge anxiety attack,
Mhm,
or just like not even wanting to be in the room for that particular activity, then we've definitely pushed too far. And so I find that if a student shows I'm not ready, but I'm willing to observe, and you can give them something to specifically look for and have a conversation with,
mhm.
that when they start to see that, okay, I feel like I might be able to step in and participate. It actually looks like fun. I think that looks better than sitting over here watching. That
Mhm.
often when the child student is the guide, they will they will let us know. They'll let us know when they're ready.
Absolutely.
I find most children don't sort of sit apart for the entire year.
No, exactly, but they've gotta have that safe feeling and that community feeling first before they can actually get to a point of participating, and, I keep talking about my placement, but I'm learning so much there, but, we have a student right now who has an injury, and so they aren't able to participate in phys ed class right now, and so last week we did a Zumba, like, workout video with them at the end of the day, and, this student was like, "Miss Simpson, can we turn the like lights off in here?" And I was like, "Sure, like it might be a little dark. Let's see what it's like." And I turned it off, and I honestly just felt a like sigh of relief from the whole class
Mm.
because the student was only going to be doing upper body movements rather than their full body movements. And the rest of the class I could just feel was at more ease because the lights were dim, so they weren't feeling like they were on the spotlight in the class to be able to participate at their full ability. And we kind of just said pick a spot in the gym that you're comfortable at. It didn't have to be like front row, or some could go to the back, some could go to the front if they were comfortable with that, but even allowing them like the space that they moved to, I felt was like very helpful for them.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, very nice. So it's just the little things that can make a
Absolutely.
big difference. And obviously, it was safe enough with the lights
Mhm.
off. Otherwise, that wouldn't have worked. So
Exactly.
you were able
Yes,
to.
yeah, it's not like it was pitch black by any means. There was still some light coming in. They could still see, and it wasn't, yeah, a danger that way.
Yeah. So you created a really amazing tips and checklist. And for those of our newsletter subscribers, so this interview is the day after they would have received their newsletter, and this is the resource that we have provided for this week, so which is very exciting. But for anyone else who's interested, it's on our website and it can be downloaded for free. But it was an amazing tips and checklist where you actually went through 4 different categories that really need to be considered to create inclusive classrooms with movement in mind for all bodies. So I thought we could again just go through those. We talked a little bit about the first one already. We were talking about environment. I'm not sure if
Mhm.
there's anything else that would be important to talk about, but again, maybe we should just talk about when we say environment, again, what do we mean?
Yeah, that means there's so many things with the environment. That means like the physical environment, like the space that you're in, like you were talking about with the auditorium and the stage, like looking at how that will look like, but also looking at like the lighting, the noise, the everything that
Mhm.
can impact a student within that environment. whether you're going outside or inside, if it's going to be too hot, too cold. There's so many things in that environment, and the checklist and the tips kind of allows teachers to just look at it quickly and think like, oh, I didn't think about this, or I didn't think about that when I was planning this movement activity with my students. I didn't think about like how long it's going to take us to get outside and then get set up, and looking at the physical barriers, but also the ones that maybe are less noticeable. Like I know noise for some students, that can be a really big distraction. So if you're outside, what is that going to look like? Are there children screaming on the playground, or is the wind and being really loud? And looking at different areas that you don't have to change your full activity that you're doing, but being mindful of those when you're planning it.
For sure. It's funny. I will tell this very brief story. I've started um, taking contemporary dance classes again. So I've been doing I've obviously danced my whole life, and last year I joined a group in Guelph, and we started up again. But because of COVID, the first four classes have been outdoors. So they've been in a someone's backyard, a beautiful big space, grassy area. But this last class that we had, which was last Wednesday. It's in October. It's getting darker earlier. And we found that halfway through the class, it was really hard to see. And
Mhm.
so you're in this environment. So you're on uneven ground, even though it's a flat surface, it's still a little bit uneven because it's grass, it's not a
Mhm.
studio floor. It is also, it was really windy and it was cold. And then
Yeah.
as we were doing more movements and you're, crossing from one side of the yard to the other, I realized that my perception was completely off because normally I would spot and I was like, wait a minute, where am I going? And what's
Yeah.
left? What's right? It was the most bizarre experience I've ever had being
Mhm.
in that kind of environment. So, anyway, it was our last outdoor class, thank goodness, because
Yeah.
realized going forward it would be very challenging
Mhm.
because it just so even taking our students outside is wonderful, but again it's just everything needs to be considered.
Exactly.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, my mobility is great, but I also didn't want to trip and somehow twist a knee.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And those minor things can happen. And I think a lot of it comes down to like pre-planning. Like
Mhm.
obviously there's times throughout the day if you're a teacher or if you're a dance instructor where you're just gonna have those spontaneous body breaks because you just realize your students need them. But when you're doing bigger things, it comes down to a lot of like pre-planning and like actually going to look at the space you're going to use, and maybe chatting with your students like on this day we're going to go and do this, what will this look like for you, and actually having that conversation with them rather than just throwing it on them and
Mm,
not actually planning out what that's going to look like.
yeah, so I think that leads really well into knowing our students.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing as an educator, like making those relationships and actually getting to know them on a one-to-one level rather than a whole class level really creates that safe learning environment for everyone in every subject, but especially when it comes to moving their bodies,
Mm,
um, and doing things that maybe they're not always comfortable with. If they feel safe with you, they can feel safe to participate in it, or they can feel safe to kind of refuse that participation as well.
mhm,
Whereas if they feel like it's forced upon them, then they're not going to feel safe to refuse that. And that's why I think the first like few months of school, even rather than just the first few weeks, getting to know like, oh, my students like this, or this student likes this, or knowing like, oh, this student has a cat that keeps them up all night. So from this time to this time, they're a little bit more fatigued. What can we do for them during these periods of the day? And
mhm,
checking in and having those conversations really benefits yourself as a teacher, but also the students, because I think often we're afraid to ask and we're afraid to be like, okay, well, what can I do for you? Or what will movement look like for you because of whatever it may be. I think oftentimes we think like, oh, I can't have that conversation. That's not being inclusive, but that actually is your inclusive community you're creating.
mhm, yeah. And I think it's really important that we know that our students know their bodies best,
Exactly.
and we need to, they're our best resource.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's like, especially with the older ages, but even in like kindergarten, they know what they need and what they want. And
Mhm.
they might not be able to express it, but they know what they need at that age.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not for us to tell them how
Mhm.
it is or how they feel or how it should be, but
Mhm.
to say, why don't you guide me?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
even not being afraid to go back and like if something didn't go as planned or you realize partway through like, oh, I've made a mistake, like acknowledging that with your student or your students as a whole and saying like, look, I wasn't intending this. Moving forward, how can we change this or what can I do if we were to do this activity again? And like that speaks volumes because if you just brush it off or ignore it, your students are going to be like, wow, they didn't notice me struggling or they didn't notice how uncomfortable I was. But if you go back and make those apologies and show that you want to change things, it really helps.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're not always going to get it right.
No.
Like, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. You will not always get it right. It's okay. That's
Mhm.
part of teaching, is that we are
Exactly.
constantly learning. So it's
Exactly.
better to try and learn from those mistakes. And sometimes it'll be amazing and you will again learn from those too.
Exactly. And I think that's the hard thing. Like teachers have to wear a lot of different roles in their day
Right.
as educators. And I think like doesn't matter how many years teachers college is, it can't prepare you for that real world
Right.
experience with the students until you've got those students in your classroom. You don't really know. It's like, okay, well, I've learned all these things, but how do I put it into practice? And actually over time having that experience or learning from others and using your resources
Yeah.
like embodied learnings or experienced teachers, it will help you improve your own practices.
Yes, absolutely. So you also talked about assessment as another sort of key thing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with assessment, we are starting to in education move away from the traditional like let's all sit down and take a test and write an essay. We're starting to move away from that, but giving students the option, so giving them like this is what you should be learning in this unit or whatever it is you're doing with them, and this is kind of what I want to see you're learning as, but giving them the option of what that looks like, whether that be a written piece, them actually performing dance or movement in some way, them making a pre-recorded video, or
Mhm.
giving them the options that make them feel comfortable. I know when I was a student, I was very much that like essay writing kind of person, and that's where I was the most comfortable and I excelled at. Whereas when I was pushed outside of my boundaries and comfort level, I wasn't as strong with the creative piece of it. And then I found that caused myself to feel like so overwhelmed, and I'd get weighed down by this one assignment because I was like, I don't know how to do it because I'm not, my brain I thought wasn't creative, but giving the students like, okay, this is how we can actually produce it, or leaving it up to them to say like, you just need to show me this knowledge that you've learned,
Mhm.
do it however you think is best.
Right. So really differentiating
Hmm.
it as well based on students' needs too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And knowing that not every student is going to want to maybe do the creative piece that you're giving them of the moving their body and showing the dance or the artistic piece of it, and knowing that ahead of time and thinking of like, okay, if my students aren't comfortable with this, what can we provide as other, I don't even like the word like alternatives to it, because
Mm.
saying like, oh, the alternative assignment is this, then really is going back to our language, and that's showing like, oh, this is for most students and then this is for the others that can't do it or don't want to do it kind of thing, but just providing those options right off the start.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I know teachers are probably like, oh my goodness, that's so many different assignments to mark. How do I mark that? And I think when you go into creating an assignment, looking at your rubric and thinking like, what are the key points I want them to come away with? What are those points? Doesn't matter how they portray those points,
Yeah.
but what are the key like three things they needed to learn from
Mhm.
this? And did they show me that they learned those three things
Right.
in their final piece?
For sure. And that can be done. They can show that in different ways. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. So the last was piece on the tips and checklist was instructional.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah. And I know we've talked a lot about like even just like the language that we use, but even when we are giving instructions to the class rather than just assuming that students know. I know you've
mhm.
shared a story before where in your class at one point we can't just assume everyone knows the game we're playing or everyone knows you
Yeah.
need to give the instructions for everyone um, involved in that. always keep that in my mind when I'm giving instructions to students. I'm like, oh, we're going to play this game. And then rather than being like, okay, everyone knows that game, right? And
Right.
moving into the game, this is actually the instructions, or these are the rules of the game, or even having students share what the rules are rather than being like, okay, we all know it, let's go on to playing, because not everyone knows those things and you can't assume that they do know it. So then that really levels the playing field for all involved.
Absolutely. His something that was really common in my childhood growing up in Canada is not going to be for that child who is new to Canada. So,
Exactly.
and it's interesting because even nursery rhymes that, you think like Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall
Yeah.
is common, but it's not common everywhere.
Yeah.
And a simple rock paper scissors game, again, not everybody knows that game or plays it in the same way because there's
Mhm.
adaptations to all of these things. So
Exactly.
right, so I think
Yeah, so keeping that in mind, and I think we have chatted a lot about this as well, is not singling out students in your instruction as well with the language you're using. So rather than saying like, oh, the alternative groups, or the using words that may be othering to students when you're giving instructions, just allowing them to choose like, oh, this is going to be the group A and this is going to be group B, and kind of explaining what group A will look like and what group B will look like. And one may be for experienced dancers, but you're not labeling that, because then it's like, okay, well, anyone that chooses that, we know they're the best, and anyone that chooses group B obviously isn't. And so then that really creates that separation between students and between you as well.
right. Yeah, absolutely. Wow, we've shared so much, just wealth of information today. Is there anything that you feel we maybe missed or any parting words that you would want people to know that's about inclusion that they should just keep in their minds?
Yeah, I think just that what we talked earlier about is we're not going to be an expert in everything, but just keep trying your best. And those minor changes that you might think seem so silly are the biggest changes you're going to make and are going to have the biggest impacts. Rather than like thinking of revamping your whole program, think about what can we do in our day-to-day lives every single day that embodies that inclusion and movement that is inclusive for all, rather than big changes. So just knowing that each day we're all learning, and we can learn from our students more than we can learn from others sometimes. So
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, Taylor. It was
thank
just such
you.
a pleasure to talk with you again about this subject. You're so passionate about it. It really, really comes through. And I do hope that people will really appreciate the tips and checklists that you created. The participation model that you talked about, we also have that for free on our website, as well as a little document on inclusive language. So those all came from the bigger resource that you created
Yeah.
as well, called Including All Bodies and Movements. So when this airs, we will make sure that we have links to all of those resources so that anyone who's interested can go and can download them. So I imagine they will be very well appreciated.
Yeah, and I would love to hear any feedback from anyone that does look them over or uses some of the things in their classroom. I would love to see what that looked like, and some feedback from that as well would be great.
Yes, I would love that too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Tracy. It was so great to chat with you. And yeah, it's awesome to kind of keep this conversation going within education, especially this year right now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to thank our viewers as well for being here with us today. And if you haven't been to our website, you can go to www.embodiedlearnings.com. And again, look for those resources. And until next week, I wish you well. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.